In the year 553 AD, a Roman emperor who had never set foot in a church convened a council of bishops and forced them to vote on one of the most radical theological decisions in the history of Christianity. The vote was not about Jesus. It was not about salvation. It was not about the nature of God. It was about whether human souls could be reborn into new bodies after death. And when the vote was over, an idea that had been held by some of the most brilliant minds in early Christian history, an idea that appeared in texts considered sacred by millions of Christians across the Roman Empire, was declared a heresy. Punishable by excommunication, punishable by death. The idea was reincarnation, and the man who banned it was not a pope, he was not a theologian. He was Justinian I, Emperor of Byzantium, a politician who understood that an empire in which souls could simply be reborn and try again was an empire in which people had far less reason to obey the church in this lifetime. The theologian he was targeting, the man whose ideas he was determined to destroy, had been dead for 300 years. His name was Origen of Alexandria. He had been called the greatest Christian thinker since the apostles. He had produced more written work than almost any other figure in the ancient world. He had risked his life for his faith during the Roman persecutions. And he had believed with full theological seriousness and extraordinary intellectual sophistication that the soul existed before the body, that it would exist after the body, and that the journey of each soul toward God was not a single lifetime, but an almost unimaginably vast process of purification that could span multiple existences. For 300 years after his death, this idea lived inside Christianity. It shaped how millions of people understood salvation, sin, and the nature of the human soul. Then Justinian decided it needed to die. And what happened next is one of the most consequential acts of theological censorship in human history. Because the question is not just whether reincarnation was banned, the question is what was lost when it was, and whether the ban actually worked. Welcome to Sacred Mysteries, where ancient secrets meet modern questions. To understand how reincarnation ended up inside early Christianity in the first place, you have to understand what the early Christian world actually looked like, and it looked nothing like what most people imagine. The image most of us carry of early Christianity is of a small, unified community of believers centered on a clear set of doctrines passed down directly from Jesus to his apostles and from his apostles to the church. That image is a myth constructed centuries after the fact. The reality was almost incomprehensibly diverse. In the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, there was no agreed New Testament, no single creed, no centralized institutional authority, and no consensus on dozens of the most fundamental questions of Christian theology. What happened to the soul after death? Was Jesus fully human, fully divine, or both? Did the material world matter spiritually, or was it an obstacle to be transcended? What did resurrection mean? Was it literal, spiritual, or metaphorical? These questions were debated fiercely and openly, and different communities gave radically different answers. In that environment, the idea that souls might be reborn was not obviously strange. It was not obviously unchristian. It was, in fact, deeply embedded in the intellectual world from which Christianity had emerged. Plato, whose ideas saturated educated thought across the entire Mediterranean world, had taught reincarnation as a philosophical certainty. In the Phaedo, written in the 4th century BCE, Plato's Socrates goes to his death with equanimity, precisely because he believes the soul is immortal and will return. In the Republic, Plato describes souls in the afterlife choosing their next lives before drinking from the river of forgetfulness and being reborn. In the Timaeus, Plato builds reincarnation into his entire cosmology. Souls that fail to live virtuously in their first life as humans will be reborn as animals, working their way back up the chain of being through successive lives. This was not fringe philosophy. This was the dominant intellectual framework of the educated Roman world. When the first Christian thinkers began to articulate their faith in Greek philosophical terms, as they had to, if they wanted to be taken seriously by the educated classes they were working, in a world where the pre-existence and transmigration of souls was taken for granted by many of the most respected minds alive. Jewish thought was not immune to these ideas either. The Pharisees, the dominant Jewish sect of the first century, the group from which rabbinical Judaism would emerge, were widely reported by ancient sources, including the Jewish historian Josephus, to believe in a form of soul transmigration. Not identical to Hindu or Buddhist reincarnation, but something in the same territory, the idea that souls could return to new bodies. The Essenes, the Jewish sect responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, had their own complex ideas about the soul and its journey through multiple existences. And within Jewish mysticism, the tradition that would eventually become Kabbalah, the concept of Gilgul, the transmigration of souls, was a central and sophisticated doctrine that persisted through the medieval period and into the present day. The world that Jesus was born into was a world in which the idea of the soul returning was alive, debated, and taken seriously by serious people. And there are passages in the Gospels themselves that suggest it was not entirely foreign to early Christian thinking. In the Gospel of John, chapter 9, Jesus and his disciples encounter a man who has been blind since birth. The disciples ask Jesus, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Stop and think about what that question implies. If the man was born blind, if he has been blind since birth, then the only way his own sin could have caused his blindness is if he sinned before he was born. The disciples are not asking a strange question. They are asking a completely natural question for people living in a world where pre-existence and karmic consequence were familiar ideas. Jesus does not say, what a ridiculous question, souls cannot exist before bodies. He says, the blindness is not the result of sin, but an occasion for the glory of God to be revealed. He answers the theological question they raised without dismissing the framework behind it. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 11, Jesus says something even more striking. He says that John the Baptist is Elijah, the great prophet who had lived 8 centuries earlier. Not that John is like Elijah, or that John fulfills the role of Elijah. He says, if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come. This is a statement of identity across time, of a soul returning in a new body. The disciples asked Jesus in Matthew chapter 17, after the transfiguration, why the scribes say that Elijah must come first, and Jesus answers that Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they pleased. The text then tells us that the disciples understood that he was speaking to them about John the Baptist. These passages have been interpreted in many ways, but none of those interpretations can entirely erase the fact that in the first century, among the people who were closest to Jesus, the idea of a soul returning in a new body was not unthinkable. It was thinkable enough to ask about. Into this complex, fertile, intellectual environment came one of the most remarkable figures in the history of early Christianity. Origen of Alexandria was born around 185 CE, probably in Egypt, almost certainly into a Christian family. His father was martyred for his faith when Origen was a teenager, and by some accounts, Origen was only prevented from offering himself for martyrdom alongside his father because his mother hid his clothes, forcing him to stay home. He was that kind of person, absolutely ferociously committed. He went on to become the head of the catechetical school in Alexandria, the most important center of Christian learning in the world, while still in his early 20s. He was by any measure a genius. He produced an estimated 2,000 works, commentaries, homilies, apologetic writings, textual scholarship. His Hexapla, a massive critical edition of the Old Testament that set 6 different versions side by side, was the most ambitious work of biblical scholarship produced in the ancient world. Jerome, one of the greatest biblical scholars of the next century, said that Origen had surpassed all other writers in the effort he put into understanding Scripture. Even people who disagreed with him could not dismiss him. He was too intelligent, too productive, too clearly motivated by genuine faith for easy dismissal, and Origen believed in the pre-existence of souls. He believed it not as a piece of Greek philosophy awkwardly grafted onto Christian theology, but as a conclusion that he believed followed necessarily from a careful reading of Scripture combined with serious philosophical thought. His argument went something like this: God is perfectly just. God is perfectly good. God does not play favorites. And yet, human beings are born into wildly different circumstances, some into wealth, some into poverty, some with brilliant minds, some with severe disabilities, some into loving families, some into abuse and neglect. If God is just, this inequality at birth cannot be arbitrary. It must reflect something. And the only thing it can reflect, if God is truly just, is the prior choices and prior condition of the soul itself. The soul must have existed before the body. It must have made choices before this lifetime. The circumstances of each life must, in some sense, reflect the spiritual state of the soul that enters it. This is not karma in the Hindu or Buddhist sense. It is not a mechanical cosmic law operating independently of God. For Origen, God is always sovereign, always present, always working toward the ultimate salvation of every soul. But the process of that salvation, the journey from the soul's original falling away from God back to its final reunion with God, is vast, far vaster than any single human lifetime. It may require multiple existences. It may require experiences in realms beyond the physical world. It will ultimately, Origen believed, result in the salvation of every soul, including, controversially, the devil himself. This doctrine, called apokatastasis, the restoration of all things, was in many ways the logical companion to his belief in the soul's long journey. If every soul is on a journey back to God, and if God is infinitely patient and infinitely powerful, then the journey must eventually succeed for everyone. Hell, in Origen's theology, is not a permanent condition. It is a purifying one. It ends, everyone comes home. You can understand immediately why this was threatening, not primarily because it was philosophically wrong. Many of the church fathers who opposed Origen could not actually refute his arguments, and they knew it. It was threatening because of what it implied for the church's power. A Christianity in which every soul is eventually saved, regardless of what the church does or does not do, is a Christianity in which the church has dramatically less leverage over human behavior. If if hell is temporary and universal salvation is guaranteed, why fear excommunication? Why rush to baptism on your deathbed? Why submit to the authority of bishops and councils and emperors if the cosmic outcome is the same for everyone in the end? The institutional implications of Origen's theology were, from the perspective of an emerging institutional church, catastrophic. And so the campaign against him began. Not immediately. Origen was revered for more than a century after his death. Many of the most important theologians of the 4th century, including the great Cappadocian fathers Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nyssa, were deeply influenced by his thought and defended him. Gregory of Nyssa himself held views on universal salvation remarkably similar to Origen's, but the 5th century brought increasing hostility. Jerome, who had once praised Origen extravagantly, turned against him with the ferocity of a man trying to distance himself from an embarrassing former association. The theological controversies became political. And then came Justinian. Here is something that almost no one talks about. The Second Council of Constantinople in 553 CE, the council that officially condemned Origen and his doctrines, was not a free theological debate. It was a political operation conducted under imperial pressure by a man who had already decided what the outcome would be. Justinian had been attempting to consolidate his empire, an empire under constant military pressure from the Persians, the Goths, and the Vandals, and religious unity was a key tool of that consolidation. An empire needed one church. One church needed one theology. One theology could not contain the wild, speculative, philosophically diverse legacy of Origen. So Justinian issued an edict before the council even met, listing 15 propositions attributed to Origen and demanding their condemnation. The bishops at the council, operating under the shadow of imperial authority, knowing what happened to people who defied Justinian, duly condemned them. Pope Vigilius, the Bishop of Rome, was present in Constantinople at the time but refused to attend the council, locked in a dispute with Justinian over other theological matters. The official condemnation of Origen therefore happened without the participation of the Pope. Its canonical validity has been disputed by theologians ever since, but the practical effect was undeniable. After 553, teaching Origen's doctrines was heresy. The systematic destruction of his works began. Of those estimated 2,000 writings, only a fraction survive, mostly in Latin translations made by Jerome and Rufinus before the condemnation, translations that were sometimes deliberately altered to remove the most controversial ideas. The Greek originals are almost entirely gone. We are reading Origen through a filter constructed by people who wanted to limit what he was allowed to say. And now the twist that changes everything. Reincarnation did not disappear from Christianity when Justinian banned it. It went underground. And it kept resurfacing century after century in movements that the church spent enormous energy suppressing. The Cathars of medieval southern France believed in metempsychosis, the transmigration of souls, as a central doctrine. They believed that souls were divine beings trapped in material bodies, cycling through multiple lives until they achieved sufficient spiritual purity to escape the material world entirely. The church launched the Albigensian Crusade against them in 1209 and spent 20 years engaged in systematic massacre before the Cathar communities were finally destroyed. The Druze, a religious community that emerged in the 11th century in the Middle East and whose members number in the millions today across Lebanon, Syria, and Israel, hold reincarnation as a core and non-negotiable belief. They consider themselves an offshoot of Islam, though mainstream Islam does not recognize them. Their doctrine of successive lives is not borrowed from Hinduism or Buddhism. It developed independently within a monotheistic framework that has more in common with early Christian Origenism than with any Eastern tradition. Within Jewish mysticism, the doctrine of Gilgul, the transmigration of souls, became a central feature of Kabbalistic thought from at least the 12th century onward and remains alive in Hasidic Judaism today. The great Kabbalist Isaac Luria, who lived in Safed in the 16th century, developed an elaborate and sophisticated system of soul transmigration that influenced millions of Jewish practitioners and continues to shape Jewish mystical thought to this day. Islam officially rejects reincarnation, but within Sufi mysticism, the mystical tradition of Islam, ideas about the soul's journey through multiple states of existence, and in some Sufi poets' writings, multiple lives, appear with enough frequency to suggest that the boundary was not as clean as the official position implied. Rumi, the greatest mystical poet in the Islamic tradition, wrote verse that many readers have interpreted as describing the soul's successive existences drawn upward through mineral, plant, animal, and human states toward reunion with the divine source. Whether this constitutes reincarnation in a strict sense is debated, but the resonance with Origen's vision of the soul's long journey home is striking. Before we answer that, we need to spend a moment with the modern evidence, because the story of reincarnation inside Christianity does not end in the medieval period. It continues into the modern world in ways that are genuinely surprising, and that the mainstream church has consistently struggled to know what to do with. In the 20th century, a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia named Ian Stevenson spent 40 years systematically investigating cases of children who claimed to remember previous lives. Stevenson was not a mystic or a spiritual enthusiast. He was a rigorous, methodologically careful scientist who understood exactly how easy it is to be fooled by wishful thinking and confirmation bias. He developed strict criteria for what counted as a credible case. The child had to report specific, verifiable details about a deceased person they could not plausibly have learned through normal means. Details about names, family members, the manner of death, the location of a home, specific events from the previous life. Stevenson investigated over 3,000 such cases across multiple cultures and continents in India, Sri Lanka, Lebanon, Turkey, and the United States. He published his findings in peer-reviewed academic journals and in several books, the most important of which is 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation, published in 1966. His work has never been definitively refuted. It has been critiqued, questioned, and largely ignored by mainstream science, which is not the same thing as being disproven. Stevenson's successor at the University of Virginia, Jim Tucker, has continued the research and published his own findings, focusing particularly on American cases that are more difficult to explain through cultural transmission. Tucker's book, Life Before Life, and his later work, Return to Life, document cases that are, by any honest assessment, difficult to explain through conventional psychological or sociological mechanisms. None of this proves reincarnation. Science cannot prove or disprove a metaphysical claim about the ultimate nature of the soul. But it does mean that the question Origen asked, what if the soul's journey is longer than a single lifetime, is not merely a theological abstraction. It is a question that serious, careful researchers in the 21st century are still asking, and they are finding things that do not fit neatly into the framework that Justinian's council established in 553. Within mainstream Christianity today, the official position is clear. Reincarnation is not Christian doctrine. The letter to the Hebrews states that it is appointed for human beings to die once, and after that comes judgment. This verse, Hebrews 9:27, is the most commonly cited biblical argument against reincarnation, and it is a genuine one. But scholars who take the question seriously note that the verse is talking about the death of Jesus as a once-for-all sacrifice, not making a general philosophical statement about the impossibility of multiple lives. The context matters, and the context has been flattened in the service of a doctrinal position that was not arrived at through purely theological reasoning. There is also the extraordinary case of the early Christian text known as the Pistis Sophia, a Gnostic gospel discovered in the 18th century and dating probably to the 3rd or 4th century CE, which contains an extended discussion of reincarnation presented as a teaching of the risen Jesus. In the Pistis Sophia, Jesus describes in detail how souls who have not yet achieved spiritual liberation are reborn into new bodies, guided by the movements of the stars and the decisions of divine beings called the receivers. The text is complex, strange, and in places almost impossible to follow, but its existence is undeniable. Here is a text produced within what considered itself a Christian community that treats reincarnation not as a foreign import, but as part of the authentic teaching of Jesus himself. It was not included in the New Testament. It was suppressed, and its suppression was not an accident or an oversight. It was a choice, a political and institutional choice about what Christianity would be allowed to mean. What does it mean that this idea, banned by imperial decree in the 6th century, declared heretical, its source texts systematically destroyed, kept coming back? It means, perhaps, that it answers something, that it addresses a question human beings cannot stop asking, the question of why. Why is this child born into suffering? Why does a good person die young while a cruel one lives to old age? Why does the moral architecture of a single human life so rarely seem to match the justice it claims to reflect? Orthodox Christianity answers this with mystery. God's ways are not our ways, and we must trust. Islam answers it. Similarly, divine wisdom transcends human understanding. These are not contemptible answers. They are honest acknowledgments of limitation. But Origen's answer was different. Origen said it does make sense. It makes perfect sense. You just cannot see enough of the picture from where you are standing. Zoom out far enough, give the soul enough time, trust in a God patient and powerful enough to bring every wandering soul home eventually, and the justice of the universe becomes visible. Not in a single lifetime across the whole arc of existence. Was Origen right? That is not a question history can answer. But here is what history can tell us. The idea was not banned because it was obviously wrong. It was banned because it was dangerously right about the wrong things. It gave people a way of understanding their suffering that did not require the mediation of an institutional church. It gave them a framework for salvation that did not depend on sacraments administered by bishops. It gave them a God whose love was so vast and so patient that no single human institution could claim to be its exclusive channel. That is not a theological error. That is a political threat, and it was treated accordingly. The books were burned, the councils voted, the emperor got what he wanted, but the idea survived. In the mystics, in the heretics, in the poets, in the millions of people across every culture and every century who have looked at a newborn child or a dying elder and felt with a certainty they could not explain that this is not the first time and it will not be the last. Whether that feeling points to a truth about the nature of the soul or simply to a truth about the human need for meaning in the face of death, that is the question you have to answer for yourself. The Church answered it in 553, but the question has refused to stay answered, and maybe that tells us something more important than the answer itself. So, here is what I want you to sit with after this video ends. Origen of Alexandria was called the greatest Christian mind since the apostles. He believed in reincarnation. He believed every soul would eventually be saved. He built one of the most sophisticated theological systems in the history of the faith. And an emperor who was not a theologian, acting for reasons that were as much political as spiritual, engineered his condemnation 300 years after his death and ordered his books destroyed. The question is not whether Origen was right about reincarnation. The question is this: when a powerful institution destroys the books of the people it defeats, how do you know what was lost? Leave your answer in the comments. And next time, we are going to look at the figure Origen himself, considered the most mysterious in all of Scripture, a being he described as existing before time, beyond the categories of human or angel, whose name appears in the Old Testament, the New Testament, and in traditions that predate both. A priest without beginning and without end. You already know his name. We are finally going to tell you his story. Stay curious.